This is LRBT3 Flaw question number 40. And this is a pretty this is a pretty tough question because it's really dense. It's hard to know what's going on. But we have an art critic who is looking at two issues that criticism focuses on. The first issue is whether the value is intrinsic to the work, and later they say, okay, if an artwork's value is not intrinsic, it must be extrinsic. So value of an artwork is either intrinsic or extrinsic. Oh my goodness, tongue twisters. The second thing that criticism focuses on is whether the judgments are objective versus subjective, matters of taste versus complete objectivity. And so they're saying that these issues are related. We have the intrinsic extrinsic principle. And our conclusion of this argument would be that judgments about the quality of the work can only be a matter of taste. And so before we even look at, what makes this argument flawed, we're thinking, okay, judgments are only a matter of taste. Well, that's the second piece of criticism. And we're talking about quality. And we're thinking, okay, how do we get that from, both of these being factors? We know value is intrinsic versus extrinsic. How does that relate to judgments about the quality of work? So it looks like they are committing an assumption, or the author is assuming something. And if we were to look at our actual question, how it's worded, it says the reasoning is most vulnerable to criticism because it takes something for granted. It assumes something. So really, this also functions as a bit of an assumption question where we're looking at our argument and seeing what gaps need to be bridged. We're looking for something that, takes this, value being intrinsic or extrinsic and relates it to this judgment of quality can only be a matter of taste. So judgments about the quality of artwork are always a matter of taste. This is something that, always, only, it's basically just shifting a word in our conclusion. So we're not necessarily assuming it, and they're not assuming that it's always a matter of taste. They're just saying that it's necessary, like the quality of work being judged by a matter of taste, like that's a necessary indicator. And always, like I guess this would be maybe a switch of sufficient and necessary, or a switch of something happening every single time, and versus in the conclusion having neat markers where we need these things to be true in order for this to happen. People sometimes agree about judgments that are only matters of taste. So we do address matters of taste in our conclusion, but we don't talk about people agreeing. And we know that it needs to link to intrinsic versus extrinsic value, and B doesn't do that. C, judgments about extrinsic value cannot be objective. Okay, well, we see that D actually talks about intrinsic value being always objective. So is it extrinsic value cannot be objective, or intrinsic value are always objective? We'll pin both of those and just look at E super quickly. E, an artwork's value is sometimes intrinsic to it. If we assume that it's not tying it to the judgment of the quality of work. So it does bring up, intrinsic, extrinsic, which is helpful, but we need it to connect. So C or D are one of our answers, and they're opposites. There's like two things that they're weighing on the spectrum: extrinsic, intrinsic, and can or cannot be objective, or cannot be objective, or always objective. There's no middle ground here. So we know that they're saying, okay, these issues are related. If artwork's value is not intrinsic, it must be extrinsic. Therefore, judgments about the quality of work can only be a matter of taste, meaning that they cannot be objective, or cannot be objective because they are always subjective. If we take it in the words of what's being mentioned here, I would say it cannot be objective. So they're linking the extrinsic, therefore judgments cannot be objective. C is that exact assumption. If we were to negate it, let's say, since we can treat this like a necessary assumption, if we say these issues are related because if an artwork's value is not intrinsic, it must be extrinsic. Judgments about extrinsic value can be objective. Therefore, judgments about the quality of work can only be a matter of taste. That leaves a lot of flaws here. So C would be our answer. And we're going to play with D really quickly just to see like what's going wrong with D. So let's say judgments about intrinsic value are always objective. If we plug that in, if an artwork's value is not intrinsic, then it must be extrinsic. Judgments about intrinsic value are always objective. So the opposite would be, judgments about, judgments that are not always objective. So judgments that are sometimes objective or just not always objective are about not intrinsic value. So they would be extrinsic values. So judgments, okay, here we go. Judgments that are not always objective are extrinsic or about extrinsic values. If we were to plug that in, for an artwork's value, like if our value, okay, if it's not intrinsic, it must be extrinsic. Judgments that are not always objective are about extrinsic values. Thus, judgments about the quality of the work can only be a matter of taste. It gets a little funky there, but I think what's helpful for us to think about is if we just, try to take these arguments at simple face value, it's just talking about intrinsic. But we know our argument is focused in on the extrinsic, and it needs us to get, this is extrinsic, therefore, it can only be a matter of taste. That's why C would be correct and D would be incorrect, because C addresses, okay, if it can only be a matter of taste, like we get that from judgments about extrinsic value never being objective. Never. And if they're not objective, they cannot be objective, means they have to be subjective. If they can't be objective, meaning, they can't be not about matters of taste, it's going to be about matters of taste. We're canceling out the double negative. So C would be the best answer here. And this is a tough question, but I think, just think about if you can plug it in and it works, that's your answer in this case. This is like a flaw necessary assumption hybrid. Or, since we recognize that this is something being assumed, we negated it and it actually broke our argument.